on our Sunday session. Very usually I do events as the local MP for Epsom where we bring along people from the community who have interesting things to say about topical issues that my constituents want to hear about and debate. The reason I do that is that I believe it's the role of a political party and a member of parliament not only to represent the concerns that arise in their community on behalf of their constituents, but also to help lead a debate about what the future of our country should be. Now, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, things have been a little different in New Zealand. We haven't been able to have those kinds of community meetings in the traditional sense, but like just about every business and every household in the country, we have innovated and found a way to bring our discussion online. And it's also had an advantage that it's been easier to get guests from a range of places, and we've been able to reach an audience outside people who come to our Epsom electorate meetings. Today, we're having the third event in the last 3 Sundays. Some people will remember we had Jeff Liu, who is the representative of the people of Taiwan in Auckland, told us about the incredible job the Taiwanese government did by going early and going smart on COVID-19. Last week, we had the executive director of the New Zealand Initiative, Oliver Hartwich, who talked us through the different responses to economic recovery after World War II by Germany versus the UK. And he showed us how a market-led response with a lot less government actually made the West Germans a lot richer than the British, who relied on government. Now we have today someone that I'm incredibly proud to present. Sir Roger Douglas was a member of Parliament from 1969, if I've got that right, Rog, to 1990, and returned again from 2008 to 2011. He's best known for Rogernomics. Roger was the Minister of Finance in the fourth Labour government, and wow, it was an incredible time in our history. If you look at all of the important pieces of legislation and policy New Zealand relies upon today, almost all of it was put in place in the period of the Rogernomics revolution. We're talking about the Income Tax Act 1986, Constitution Act 1986, the Reserve Bank Act 1988, I think, 89, the State Sector Act, the State-Owned Enterprises Act, just about everything that you can think of that underpins modern New Zealand legislatively was done in reforms by Sir Roger's government. He also led massive change in economic policy as finance minister. We went from being a country where you literally had to apply to the Reserve Bank to get a subscription to an overseas magazine to one of the most open economies in the world in 4 short years. So Roger, it's a real pleasure to have you along. Thanks for giving up your time and meeting with us today. What we're going to do is basically move through this in 3 parts. So first of all, we've had a lot of commentary about the period in history that you were really the leader of policy development in New Zealand. And some people have been very praiseworthy. I'm obviously in that camp. Other people have been quite critical. So we thought we'd have a bit of a history refresher for 1 or 2 people out there who are a bit critical. And then the latest thing that you've done, Roger, is the paper In a New World, New Thinking is Required. And you've basically put out a response to the fiscal position the government finds itself in, which is not unlike where we were in 1984. You've got a government that's very tempted to spend, and maintain its own power, just as Muldoon did in the early 80s. And you've got an opportunity for enormous growth, just as we had after the 90s. And that's why we thought it was worth getting you on to talk about this paper, because I don't think there's anyone that's got more relevant experience of what New Zealand currently faces. And finally, we've had record numbers of questions. Whenever we do an event like this, we invite people from the audience to email in their questions. We've had the Reserve Bank governor, we've had the old Reserve Bank governor, we've had the mayor of Auckland, we've had the US ambassador, we've had the British High Commission representative, but we've never had as many questions as we got for Roger Douglas. So we're going to try and get through your questions at home too. But I've done enough talking, the purpose of which, by the way, is to get the audience to build up before the guest speaks. So without further ado, welcome, Sir Roger. And can we just start with the historical part of it? What was it like, and what did you discover? What was the situation New Zealand found itself in? Was it July 14, 1984, you became the Minister of Finance?
Well, I think the first thing you noticed was the banks were closed for 1 or 2 days, and we needed to move on that. And without going back too much in history, Muldoon wanted to tell us what to do. He still wanted to run the show. He had a disastrous performance, I think, on television, and Longy was brilliant. And I think probably Jim Maclay, as much as anyone, brought Muldoon into line, where Muldoon said that he would essentially pass whatever the new government decided that they needed passing. And that's when we did the devaluation, where we got rid of price controls and interest rate controls, and a whole host of other measures that we could do relatively simply, but were significant decisions in themselves. And once we'd got that ball rolling, we tried to keep it going. And you've mentioned some of the things, tax relief, but some of the early things that we did was to try to open up the economy, getting rid of import licensing, getting rid of lowering tariffs quite dramatically, and things of that nature, which freed up the economy. We had the budget in November. We always had a policy during those 3 years, try to give people as much notice of what you're going to do as possible. Obviously, the GST was a big part of that. And along with introducing GST, we got rid of all the taxes that were indirect taxes that were there, apart from, I think, liquor and petrol.
Yeah. So I think this is really worth visiting. So we've got Bronson Perrich here says, so we're going to let the guy who caused mass unemployment talk about stopping mass unemployment. Now, I suspect that if we went into Bronson's full Facebook profile, it'd say that one of the things he enjoys most is being enamored of his own wit. But I think it's really important to get back to what things were actually like. So when you talk about price controls, you got rid of those. But
yeah.
Just for people who may not be familiar, we had Muldoon for 2 years ordered every price and wage and interest rate to be frozen for 2 years.
And I think prices still went up by 4 or 5% during that period of time.
And when you talk about import control, so if I was a farmer that wanted to bring in a tractor, say, how did that work?
Well, depends who had the import licensing. David, people used to get rich because they could get an import license. You didn't have to be smart. You didn't have to be clever. All you had to do was get the government to give you an import licensing. And I can remember I was company secretary of the carpet factory, and that's what we were all about. But on the side, we had an import licensing for linoleum. And the truth was, because there was only a limited amount of license for that, you could virtually charge what you like. And that was pretty expensive. And we get rid of import licensing. We got rid of a lot of privilege. That was a very big item of privilege, which I guess some people probably joined the National Party because of it.
So there was and this is where the politics gets really interesting, because of course you were a Labour Party that brought about the most significant market-oriented reforms in the country's history, and yet it all makes sense once you see that the working people were having to buy a limited range of inferior goods from the people who were privileged with the import licenses, and so that's how you square the circle.
I think if you think about, people used to ask me, and a little bit along the lines you're asking there. How could you, as a Labor member of Parliament, a Labor minister, possibly have done the things you did? And I said, which my answer was, look, all we did and what we based our policy on was removing privilege. In other words, we took the privileges away and opened the place up. I mean, let's think about some of the things. We took away some of the tax breaks that Muldoon had put in there for farmers. We had deer that people were paying $2,800. When we took the tax advantage away, the price went down to what the market, the real market price was $700 or $800 overnight. It was artificial, and it just simply didn't work.
So when you say a deer, you mean like the animal was?
Yeah, animal. Oh, sorry. It's what do we call it? There was a special standard values. It was. Sorry,
right.
If I could explain. What you had was, say, the deer. You bought a deer, and farmers bought it. Politicians bought it. Lawyers, everyone was buying deer. Then they'd get someone to stock it. They'd buy it at 2.8. They could write it down to 200, or let's say 200. So they got 262, and so they had a tax write-off of about 2,600. Muldoon's tax rate was 66 cents in the dollar. So that was a tax break of 1,800. You could take off what you earned as a politician or a lawyer or a doctor. So everyone thought, oh, well, there, I've got this, bought this deer or whatever else they might have bought. And really, I paid 2,800, but Muldoon paid 1,800 of it. I only paid 1,000. Well, sorry, it was only worth $1,000. And when you see that go on, what happens is, what you come to realize is that the person who benefits from those tax breaks is never, ever the person that was intended to benefit. In the end, the farmer didn't benefit. The person who sold it did. But you look at lambs, or we had, we'd pay so much per kilo, or whatever it was then, our measure, and the increase in production went from whatever it was, early 20,000 to 30-odd thousand. Guess who benefited? Yeah. Iran benefited, because they bought all our surplus that we couldn't sell to anyone at a reasonable price. They bought it cheap. So all these huge subsidies got benefited Iran, never benefited the New Zealand farmer or New Zealand.
So moving to where we got to, it is almost funny, except for the fact it was so expensive. So you had this massive scam going on with something as simple as a deer, which advantaged people, first of all, tax accountants, second of all, people who could afford tax accountants, and lastly, the average working person who was paying for this great deer scam. Same thing going on with street. But then, so this was all freed up, and the economy took off. We ended up with a major crash in 87, which appeared to pause the recovery. But through the 90s, we had productivity growth that was far better than any period in the previous decades, and actually better than we've had since, after some of the reforms were walked back. So, what was the payoff from your point of view? Did you feel good about this by the end?
Well, I think the productivity gains, you're right. Well, I mean, if you look back for the last 60 years, the only time that we have been above the average in the OECD would have been for a few years during the 90s. And you take the last 6 years, why are we a poor country? Why are we in a position where our incomes are so low, and it's basically productivity. And until we fix productivity, we're not going to go anywhere. Now, we did fix it in the sense of the state-owned enterprises. What we showed there with the state-owned enterprises was that we could have productivity gains of anywhere from 30 to 50, even higher percent. And we need to do that, I might add, in the social welfare area.
Yeah. Okay, so moving to where we are today, you've just released this paper. In a new world, new thinking is required. The situation that New Zealand faces is pretty dire. You've got projections of 15% property price drops, double-digit unemployment, 15% drop in economic output. That 15% unemployment, that's potentially hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and deficits by the government of tens of billions of dollars that have to come from somewhere.
30 billion, probably.
Was that
20 or 30 billion, probably?
Yep, and that's over multiple years, or that's for several years, as I understand it. So here we find ourselves again, and you've come out with this paper, and I'll let you talk us through it. But what I got out of it is that if the government's going to do relief, then it needs to target it, not just throw it at a whole lot of people. The government's got to be very conscious of debt, because money borrowed now, there is no free lunch. It's got to be paid for by somebody at some point. The only way to guarantee justice for future generations is to reduce expenditure now, because it's going to be paid for by future generations otherwise. And you show how you could reduce expenditure by 15 billion. And then you say, look, we've got to do something about the way the welfare system works, because there's a whole lot of people that have paid it a lot getting nothing out. And there's also people that are getting a lot more than they expected. So you suddenly say, okay, what if we were to have a thing called a personalized risk account, which I'll let you explain.
Well, that was really tied to the short term. It seems to me that you've got here is an issue. No one will deny that we don't have a short-term issue. Obviously, with health, I put that aside, but that has led to a crisis in terms of the short term. We're going to have these huge deficits, and it's about what we do about that in the short term and the long term. But just make one point, that to the extent that you can, and I'm not saying it's possible with all your measures that you take to help in the short term should, as far as possible, be able to help in the long term as well. So you keep that in mind. It seems to me that you've got the first question that we asked when we did this paper: who are we trying to help? And who the people we're trying to help is obviously those who are unemployed, who have been made unemployed, and those small businesses that could go out of existence without some help, but with a little help could stay in business, so it's worth mending. And that's essentially the people we saw as the people that we're trying to help in the short term. And we wanted to use our resources, in other words, to best account. And that's a basic thing in economics. You use your resources, and it's pretty important now. Now, one of the things that we did in this paper, and I know you've talked about this, David, is you have to use those resources well. And part of looking at how well you're doing your resources is to look at your existing spending. And there is probably the best part of $8 or $9 billion that I would say is either unnecessary expenditure, low value, or bribes and privilege. And then there's another $5 or $6 billion, largely of income, but income and expenditure, which could be used to better account. And a thing like, for example, the tax breaks or the subsidies that go to KiwiSaver, the funding of the KiwiSaver fund, and the income from that. And if you add those up, you've got about $15–16 billion, and you could add to that the waste of the present government has added to it. And to me, the first thing about that, you use that money to help you through the short term. That means you're borrowing less. You're not loading future generations as much as you otherwise would. And when you get through the crisis, or as you get through the crisis, you use that money to actually solve, if you like, the welfare issues that we have. And we have some very real problems in the welfare issues. We're going to hit a brick wall. The debt's not just going to be what we borrow to get over this crisis. It's the fact that our households have very high debt anyway. And then there's the debt that we owe to people who are going to retire. And if you look at those three, we're going to hit a wall. The first thing, of course, in trying to move forward is you've got to get people to recognise that you do have a problem. Because if people don't recognise that you've got a problem, then you're not actually, well, they're not going to get behind it. So that was important in the 80s. People actually realised you've got a crisis. I think that's what's helping the present government in terms of people know we've got a health crisis. They just don't know how big the economic crisis is going to be. And so where is the problems in the future? Right through welfare. People don't know how bad it is. I mean, if you take education, the testing of 5-year-olds and 9 years in maths and science, we're the bottom of the heap. Our performance is going backward. Most other countries are going upward. But if amongst English-speaking countries where English is the main thing, we're bottom. We're bottom. And so you go on. Our productivity in education in the last 24 years has averaged minus 1.4%. I mean, that's disgraceful.
Yeah.
So the people who are most affected are the poor and the disadvantaged, the Maori, Pacific Island, who used to be in my electorate.
So let's break this down a little bit. First of all, can I just acknowledge the audience we've got watching here? We're actually outrating. We've got more people watching this than the Epidemic Response Committee. So thank you, everybody watching, and thank you, Roger, for drawing a big crowd after all these years. But if we break down the response in your paper, so first of all, there is stage one, targeted support for businesses that probably would be viable but need help to get through right now. Stage two is getting on top of the fiscal blowout and explaining to people, look, if you have KiwiSaver subsidies, if you have fees-free tertiary education, if you have working for families at its current rate of generosity, if you have winter energy payments for pensioners, all of this stuff adds up to a massive debt for future generations. And you need to be honest about that and start shifting the fiscal framework to something that's actually sustainable. And then your third stage is we got to confront the fact that the social services we have, and I think we've said this before, that the means of delivery, the benefits, the schools, the teacher unions, have become the objective more than the object, which is, or the real goal, which is supposed to be about getting kids equipped for the 21st century. So just starting with the first part, what does it look like to do support for businesses that need help coming out of COVID? And what has the government done wrong to date that you would have done differently?
Well, essentially, the first thing I would have done, if you were going to have that sort of helicopter approach, which the government had, have it for 4 weeks. Use those 4 weeks to get yourself organised so that you can make it targeted from there on. Don't continue to give to people who have millions of dollars or have companies worth billions government handouts. They don't need it. They're capable of organising themselves. So essentially, make it targeted, make it go to the people who really need it. And there's an awful lot of people out there who need it.
Yeah. There has been a real set and forget approach from the government. So they said, right, we're handing out money for 12 weeks, hands off. And there hasn't been a willingness to reassess as new information has come to light. So I think it's fair to say that the initial fear that tens of thousands of people would die probably was never true. And we can see that now. But also the ability to rethink the economic policy has been pretty limited as well. So as part of what you're saying, that you'd have more sort of nuanced and more agile responses as the situation evolved?
Well, I think too, David, that in some ways it's a little unfair to the people who are still on the books, if you like. I mean, I think that's more to do with politics than caring actually for individual New Zealanders. I mean, if I'm going to be made redundant, I'd probably prefer to know early rather than wait to the end of the 12-week period and find I'm made redundant then. So to me, what would happen if a person is going to be made redundant, then they would see welfare like they do. They get the benefit immediately, but there would be a questionnaire and a form they could fill in if they needed additional help. And the people who would definitely need additional help is going to be people with families, people with mortgages, and then you can help them through a period until they can get employment. But otherwise, we could run into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. So a parallel to what you faced in '84 is that today we have a huge number of people. They want their fees-free tertiary, they want their gold card, they want their Kiwi Saver subsidy, they want their winter energy payment, and yet it's not in the long-term good of New Zealand to spend money in those ways. You had to make the case that really a much deeper set of entitlements needed to be dismantled to the whole country, and then went on to win the '87 election having done it. How do you make the case to people today that having low quality, unsustainable spending has to stop, and people are going to take a personal cost for the long-term future of New Zealand and therefore their long-term future?
Well, I think you've got to talk to them openly. One of the things that you have to do is provide them with the information. I mean, you should never underestimate the average New Zealander. They've got a lot of common sense. I mean, they buy a house, they do all sorts of things. And politicians generally, I think, underestimate them, and they shouldn't. You've got to be honest with them. You've got to, wherever possible, if there's going to be change and it's going to be adversely affect some people, then the earlier you can tell them in advance, the better. In other words, you give them some notice. We did that with, for example, when we were lowering tariffs. We lowered tariffs. We had across the board, if you're almost lowering of tariffs, and then we needed to lower tariffs more, and we gave them a 4-year program. But we told people right now what's going to happen for the next 4 years. The first year was going to be a third, and then 20% and so on, but of that reduction or whatever it was. So people could actually plan. And what people said, okay, I'm manufacturing all these things. Which ones can I still manage to manufacture and be viable? And they did that. And they started to import, or made arrangement for themselves to import product that made up, their range.
So that takes you on to the third part of your agenda laid out in this paper, which is and I just wonder if the people doing the production for this might be able to put up a link on screen to the paper. I don't know if that's possible, but if it is, please chuck it up there. The situation that you outline is one where even if we get through the current problem of doing stimulus that helps the right people, and even if we get through the situation of managing the fiscal blowout that we appear to have, what do we do in order to get the welfare state retooled to achieve its original objectives for the people that most need it?
Well, I think that people, first of all, have got to understand what's wrong with the welfare state. David, let me just briefly, this is what I said 3 months before, and this is what I mean about taking people into your trust. This is what I said 3 months before the 1987 election. I made the point, and it was published Towards Prosperity, End and Means, a welfare state that almost always puts institutions ahead of people. I'll tell you what, 35 years later, same thing, same problem. A welfare system where the distribution of resources amongst and within the social service institutions is often ridiculous. So, if you get hurt on a football field, your treatment will be a heck of a lot better than if you fall off the trampoline, probably. An education system where the middle class captures most of the money spent on tertiary education. Same thing. An education system that is not good at shifting resources in response to different needs of its students. A health system where the argument is often about public health versus private health, which is not the real issue at all. The real issue should be, how do we ensure resources go to where they're most needed? How do we achieve greater flexibility in the social services? And how do we achieve a benefit system that supports without taking away the incentive for work? And those were the issues I raised back then. Of course, Longy was unhappy and he wouldn't make the changes that I believe were necessary. 35 years later, we're still in trouble. The last 12 years, productivity has been zero in health. And I made the point here in the book there, that if we could reduce the costs or improve the productivity actually in health by a third, we'd be able, with the same amount of money, to expand our output by 50%. And that's what we did in every area of government activity that was of a business nature, whether it was the post office, whether it was telecom. And unfortunately, we didn't tackle the welfare areas. Michael Bassett wanted to. We appointed Alan Gibbs. He did a report. He said basically 30 to 50% improvement could be made in that area. But we refused to do it. And until we do that, not only in health, but elsewhere, we're going to run up against the wall.
Yeah, and I can completely relate to this because I've tried to do reform in education at a smaller scale than you did. But when we introduced the charter school program, the idea was that we weren't worried about the institutions, we're worried about the student, and the student's needs came first. If somebody could come up with a school an idea for running a school that would engage kids, get them to attend first, because that's one of the biggest problems, and then learn while they're there, then we would be able to get better outcomes. So those kids could go into the 21st century with the skills required to provide for themselves and their families, to get skills that turned into jobs, that turned into careers. And ultimately, they could feel good about themselves. I mean, that's what we were trying to do with charter schools. And
well,
it's so funny how...
with it, David.
What's that, Joe?
I said there's only one thing wrong with it.
What was that?
How did they restrict you to 12 schools?
Well, that was a big part of the problem. But what was the same was that so many people rallied around the existing institutions, the existing schools, even though the students actually didn't want to go to the existing schools. If they did, we wouldn't have needed charter schools. And so it's funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same. But the critical issue is that we've got to put the customer of the welfare state ahead of the institutions providing.
Absolutely. And that was a basic part of what I said in that chapter in Toward Prosperity, because it was very clear to me, and that was before the election, 3 or 4 months before the election. It was very clear to me that unless we had fundamental change in the welfare system, it wasn't going to work. And 35 years later, it doesn't work. And it's still true. It's the institutions are capturing it rather than it's serving the needs of the pupils. And
so we'll go to people's questions in a sec, but just finally, in your latest paper, you talk about the concept of a personalized risk account. Can you talk us through what that looks like?
David, I think probably a little misunderstanding. I've covered that in a way. If someone's made unemployed, they go along, say they've got a family of 3 and they've got a mortgage and etc. Made unemployed, they'd get the normal, what I still call, I know it's not, unemployment benefit, and then they would be able to apply for additional help. Now, when they get the additional help, it would go into this special account. So that's the short term. I personally believe, and there's a personal belief, and I've had this for a long, long time, is that we have to have personal accounts right through the welfare system. And until we go to a system where there's choice, where we go to the decision where individual people are making the decisions for themselves and not allowing politicians to tell them what school they have to go to. So if they want to go to charter school, they can go to a charter school. They can go to a school, any school that has been approved. And approval shouldn't be withheld unless there's very, very strong reason. And the fact that parents want to send their children to a particular school, for me, in 999 times out of 1,000 would be sufficient evidence that the school should exist. So I would see, personally, people having their own savings account for retirement, but for both income and health. I think that's necessary too, in terms of out of work. I think we've got to change that. You see, so that people have an account and buy their own risk insurance, and so on. And housing, of course, is dramatic. I personally think that the item, well, maybe it's changed now, but if we went back 3 or 4 months, the item that was increasing most, the cost, was likely to be the subsidies for people for rent and for mortgages. And you can't have a position that we've got in housing now where house prices, well, it's happened actually, house prices over the last 20 years have doubled on 2 occasions. They doubled under Helen Clark, they doubled under John Key, and an absolute damn disgrace.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree more. And it's really interesting to look at some of the comments where the people in the comment section here saying, oh, well, Roger Douglas got a pension and Roger Douglas got a free education and it's not fair, we have to pay. But I actually think that the intergenerational
free education.
You didn't?
I said no one gets a free education; they pay tax.
Yeah. Well, and 66% when you graduated. But I think that the point I want to make about this, though, is that this intergenerational story doesn't have to be one generation against another. I think that, we got to confront that. First of all, we need fiscal sustainability. We need to get solid fiscal policy that doesn't pass debt from one generation to another. And we won't go into housing now because it's a whole topic in itself. But we certainly need to confront the fact that we have a major problem with being able to build houses that people can afford, that are connected by infrastructure to opportunity, by which I mean education and jobs. Whether the government pays through taxes or whether people pay directly, solving that problem is in the interest of all generations in the long term. But we want to start going to some questions because we've gone on for 40 minutes already. It's just flying by. And we've got Rachel Jane here on Facebook. I just put up on the screen. Says 3 critical things New Zealanders should hope to see from the budget next week if we're going to address some of the challenges we're likely to face in the next 12 months. That's similar to a question by email from Sam. What fiscal route do you see the current Minister of Finance taking for this budget? What do you think will be good and why? What will be foolhardy and why? So, Roger, it's a budget on Thursday. You brought down, it must have been at least 5 budgets in your time. What would you be doing or looking up for? What do you think the government will do? What do you think they should do this Thursday?
Good question. First of all, if you're going to do a budget, you have to ask yourself what you're trying to achieve. And so this particular budget would be a difficult one in that you're trying to help. It's got to be aimed at helping those people who are in difficult circumstances get through the next 6 to 12 months. And that's essentially the people that I've already talked about, those people who have been made unemployed and those people who have maybe small businesses, in Pukekohe or wherever it is, and could save their businesses with a little bit of help. And for that, you have to possibly provide them with some expert advice and get on with it. Longer term, you know what I'd do, actually? The first thing I'd do, I'd set up about 5 or 6 SOE committees to be working, because alongside, as you get through the crisis and the short term, hopefully relatively short term, although as you say, going to go on for 1 or 2 years or more, I would have one into education, health, out of work, how we do that, and housing for a start. That's what we did with the SOEs, and you saw the amazing differences that it made. I talked about Alan Gibb. He looked at health for me, and Michael Bassett more particularly than me, and he said there was 30 to 40% to be gained. This is the person who looked after forestry. In the last year, it was a forestry department. I paid out $180 million in taxpayers' money. Guess what? 2 years later, I got a check for $132 million. An enormous turnaround. Well, I mean, it was only, the turnover was only 400 or 500. How the hell it was done, I don't know. But you get people like that into the position. And I would have people like Alan Gibbs, not that he'd do it these days, and to have a look at education, health, and tell us what we need to do to be able to have that sort of turnaround. Let me tell you a story. I've never told this story before. It reminded me that because we'd done so well on the SOEs and, spectacular turnarounds like the one I've just said on forestry, I thought we've got to do this amongst the other areas like education and health. So I got hold of, remain nameless, and said to him, why don't you consider putting your name in to become head of the education department? And I think I did the same. Oh no, health didn't need to because we had the review on and whatever. Came back and saw me, David, about 2 or 3 months later. He took it really serious. He says, Roger, he said, I can't do it. I wouldn't do it. I said, well, why wouldn't you? He said, look, at the end of the day, if I was chief executive and I did what was needed, you politicians wouldn't give me the support that I need. It's too scary for you. And that's what you're up against. But I believe there's huge productivity gains to be made. And if you had a 30% or 30% improvement in or reduction in cost, that's a 50%. That's about $6 billion. You'd have $6 billion more to put into health if that's what you want to do. So I guess that's what that's one of the things I'd do for sure. Yeah. And a year down the track, I'd be ready to improve a lot of them.
Yeah. Roger, we just got to take a short break from programming while we beat up someone saying something stupid because it's all part of the service. So Johnny Vosberg says that neoliberal Rogernomics destroyed a lot of what was good about New Zealand. Blah, blah, blah. He then goes on to claim that the reason that there are so many trucks on the road is that politicians are bribed to sabotage the railways. Johnny, here's a much more plausible explanation. New Zealand's a really spread out country. Most of the things that go on trucks are going to a lot of smaller towns, remote areas, and coming from places like Forest, which are spread out all over the place. And that's why we don't use trains, because trains, by definition, go to a very limited number of locations. I'm guessing Johnny doesn't work in logistics, but every now and then I'd just like to take someone like that and point out how inane some of the objections and conspiracy theories are. Thank you for playing. Anyway.
One of the interesting things about railways, of course, David, was they used to employ 18 to 20,000 and we turned it into an SOE. The numbers of employed definitely went down to about 7,000 or 8,000. But, you know, productivity and output actually grew. And what people need to understand that you cannot have equity unless you've got efficiency. And those people that, like the gentleman who put that statement up, just simply does not understand that only with efficiency can you have equity. They are not separate things. They are one and the same.
Yep. Just going on this, we said we would steer away from this beforehand, but there are quite a few questions on email about monetary policy. You were there when the Reserve Bank was made independent under the Reserve Bank Act. You had a huge battle with inflation in the 80s, such that people my age, born in 1983, have no idea what inflation is. Well, I mean, I've read about it, but I've never experienced it. Now we're seeing the idea that the Reserve Bank is going to basically print money and sell New Zealand dollars to the government in return for government paper for bonds. And a lot of people say, well, this is a panacea, right? This is literally free money. What do you say to people who think that maybe the way forward is simply like softer monetary policy?
Well, you're going to have to pay for it at some point, I think, David. I mean, it seems to me that we came into government where Muldoon had a 3-year election strategy, and about 18 months before the election, he loosened up monetary policy. And the result of that was very high inflation. And it went on for a long, long time. And whilst we're paying have very low interest rates today, if things get out of hand, then the interest rates are going to go back up and fast.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, I came in, we had 20%. We had 20% interest rate mortgages.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, it wasn't great being Minister of Finance when that was happening.
I bet. I just want to raise something. Somebody in these email questions asked about the universal basic income. We've had a Liam Ansell Douglas, who I assume is no relation, asking a question on Facebook. And the question about the universal basic income, where you basically say everybody, perhaps everyone over 18 or maybe just everyone alive, gets a certain amount of money every week or every year. It's something that appeals to a lot of people. I don't favor it, but I won't go into that right now. A lot of people tie it to you because in your 88 budget proposal, you had a GMFI, a guaranteed minimum family income, which sounds like a universal basic income. I'm not sure it is, but can you talk us through your view of a universal basic income and whether or not the GMFI was similar?
Well, the UBI is nuts. In a word, and we can go through why. It was first promoted by Charles Murray, and I read about it. I remember I was flying. I can't tell you where I was flying to the States, sorry. And I read about it in The Economist. I thought, that sounds great. Rushed into the bookshop and bought it. And he had me for 40 pages. And then I realized what the marginal tax rates were going to be. But what I proposed in 1987 with the GMFI was totally different. What the GMFI was all about was giving a top-up to people who were working full-time. So you had someone with 4 or 5 children maybe who was working full-time and they earned whatever. But what the top-up said was, if you're working full-time, we will guarantee that you will get $150 more than someone who is not working and in the same circumstances who's basically living at home and not working. So it was a top-up which gave a margin to someone who was working. And I still believe in that.
So in other words, that they're very different concepts. The universal basic income is give everybody money, raise to stay home, raise taxes to pay on people that do work to pay for it, and watch what happens. Well, predictably, people work a lot less, we all get poorer. The GMFI was effectively a policy that if you worked 40 hours a week, your income would be topped up to a given amount. And so the guaranteed minimum family income was exactly what it said it was.
Yes, and it essentially went to low income people. It went to, if you like, those who earned the lowest income available, I guess.
Yeah, and people in the comments here saying, well, the GMFI is that not effectively just the family tax credit?
Well, it was at that stage, it was simply the idea was you earned $400 and you believe that someone who was married with 5 children, the minimum that they could live off was $550, then the government gave them the $150.
Okay. Switching gear a bit, I mean, one of the things that your government did in the 80s and something you've supported ever since is free trade. And, you know, I'm a supporter of free trade for a whole bunch of reasons, probably the same ones. But geopolitics, I think, has made it a bit more complex. And somebody asked here, Matt Haberson, what do you think New Zealand should do to prevent itself being dependent on one country for a large amount of its exports, given what has happened recently and the geopolitical issues that are boiling up around China? Now, at the same time, we've got people, Winston Peters, for example, saying it's time for New Zealand to introduce or reintroduce this vast bureaucracy to decide what things need to be produced in New Zealand, what things can be imported, what sort of skills can come in on immigration. I mean, what's your message for people who want to go back to, I guess, a much more limited regime of trade and start discriminating against countries such as China?
It's fine, not a problem, so long as they're happy to be poor. If they want to be poor, it's a damn good policy. But if you want to be affluent and rich, then it's not going to help very much. And seriously, David, it demonstrates, I think, a lack of understanding about where business has gone. There are businesses in New Zealand which are doing very, very well in export. They might be buying a portion of the product from maybe China, maybe it's Vietnam or whatever. It might be 10%, and they add the extra 90% to it. In the design, the packaging, the marketing, they do all those things. But if they had to pay double for the product itself, they wouldn't be in business because they couldn't compete. Okay. And it just, to me, it shows a total lack of understanding about how the market works.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, thank you very much, Roger. I really appreciate your time. We've gone well over time, but it's actually just flowing by. And we've had a superb discussion. We've had great numbers of people watching, great comments and questions. So a big success all round. And this video will remain available on the ACT Party YouTube and on the David Seymour Facebook page. It's available for people who want to watch, catch up with things that Roger said. And we'll be doing another Sunday session next month. I just also say to people that we're 133 days from the election. ACT is vigorously contesting it because, frankly, we don't want to see a high debt, low growth, government-led recovery from this current crisis. We want to see a low tax, low debt, private sector-led recovery where people actually get wealthier. And we're going to be relying on people such as the audience to this event, helping us out. So if you're not a member of ACT, please consider going along to our website, act.org.nz, and joining up. And if you want to help have some influence over the way that this country develops over the next 3 years, then you've got a great opportunity to do so by helping out because, like I say, 133 days to the election. Without anything more from me, thank you very much, Sir Roger, for the service that you've given to New Zealand over several decades, the leadership you've shown in putting in place policies that have been copied around the world and that no government has reversed despite 4 changes of government since the policies were introduced. And thank you for giving up your afternoon to be part of our Sunday session.
Well, I wasn't going anywhere, David.
All right. We'll see you later. Thanks, everybody.